Now we'll take a step back a minute, and one of the things that made this kind of folk music so popular at one time, back in the 1960s, was the development of these folk festivals. And we still have folk festivals today. They may not be quite as much of a rage as they were at one point in the 1960s and 70s during the height of the folk revival, but these have been very important for the preservation of folk music in the Ozarks and for encouraging a younger generation to get interested in folk music. People like Butch mentioned earlier, Joan Baez, and you had people your age back in the late 50s and early 60s who were into this kind of music. It may surprise some of you now to listen to that and think, how could college-age students be into that? But that was part of the folk revival in those days. That was kind of getting back in touch with your roots or your family's roots or roots that you never really had but you wish you had. Making contact with something authentic in an age when many people thought that everything was becoming homogenized, and you had the growth of these suburbs, and you had a whole generation of kids who were coming of age who really had no connection to a rural past, and all of a sudden found it in music, and found it in other things as well, but certainly in music. And so this was big. But the folk music festival, or the folk festival movement in the Ozarks, can be traced back to the 1930s. The first festivals took place in 1934, and these festivals were designed to highlight dying musical traditions and dying arts and crafts traditions. We've talked about folk art in the Ozarks and crafts and things like that. Well, those first folk festivals, which were held in places like Eureka Springs, and eventually one was held here in Springfield in 1934, that's what they were about, was kind of capturing these fleeting traditions. Of course, we think back, that was almost 80 years ago, and we're still often doing the same thing now. So the traditions weren't maybe as near death as they were afraid they were in 1934. But that's what was going on. The festivals, basically, how many of you have been to a folk festival before? Anybody? Okay, several people have been to a festival. They work basically like they do now. You would have performances of traditional music. This is pre-bluegrass in 1934, so these were fiddle tunes and banjo music and ballads that were often unaccompanied by instrumental music. And you would generally have these performed by old-timers, like the ones who've been singing these songs we've been listening to and the ones who are pictured. You would often have in these folk festivals often displays of folk art and basket making and blacksmith work and all that kind of stuff, the various folk traditions that people in the Ozarks and in rural America had at that time. And the idea was to put these on display and people come out and sort of gain a new appreciation for them, maybe work to preserve these traditions, and maybe make a little money, especially for those who were selling white oak baskets or corn shuck dolls or things like that, put a few pennies in their pocket. It is the middle of the Depression, after all, in 1934. And these folk festivals, probably had it not been for the Depression and then for World War II, probably would have caught on before that and become steady year in and year out things. As it was, the folk festival movement pretty much peters out at the time of World War II when the focus of the entire country shifts to other more important things during the war effort. But after the war, the festivals start back up in the Ozarks, with the first one taking place, the Ozark Folk Festival in Eureka Springs, Arkansas in 1948. And this again, brings out traditional singers, musicians, craftspeople, all that kind of stuff. And this becomes an annual event. The Ozark Folk Festival goes on and on. It's still going on today in a different form, but Eureka Springs still has a folk festival every year. And then the one that becomes the kind of runaway success story of Ozark Folk Festivals starts in 1963, and that's the Arkansas Folk Festival, which is still going on today. It will take place again in April of this year. And it was planned in part by Jimmy Driftwood, the guy that we talked about earlier. This was in his home county in Stone County, Arkansas, and by several other people. It was a lot of the people involved in these early folk festival movements, and the Arkansas Folk Festival, were actually extension agents. Does anybody know what an extension agent does? That's what originally extension agents were designed to. They were experts in different kinds of agricultural methods and stuff like that, and they were on the ground people who helped farmers. You would have an extension agent in each county, or maybe multiple agents, depending on how big the county was and the different kinds of agriculture you had going on. And these extension agents would help farmers come up with new strategies to make a living and new ways to plant this and grow that and all that kind of stuff. Well, by the early 1960s, with the day of the family farm quickly disappearing, extension agents were thinking of other ways to help people make a living. And in Stone County, Arkansas, the extension agents were very much involved with the founding of this first Arkansas Folk Festival. It was a way to bring tourists to the county. It was good for getting people to spend money in Mountain View, for anybody who was making stuff to sell in this folk festival. And so in April of '63, they had the first one. Within a couple of years, it had just become a monster success. The heart of the folk revival. This is in the age when college-age students and people in their 20s and 30s were really getting into folk music, authentic music of all kinds, whether it was the blues or this kind of white mountain music. And people would come down from Chicago and come from all over the country to go to these folk festivals and see these old-timers dressed in granny dresses and overalls and all that kind of stuff, singing their songs that they had learned from great-grandma and had passed down in their families. And it was an exciting time for this folk revival. By the early 1970s, the Arkansas Folk Festival had gotten so big that they spread it out over 2 weekends instead of just one weekend, and had to bring in police from all over the place to help. You know, there were tens of thousands of visitors who would come into this little town, and there was nobody famous singing at these things. That was part of the charm of it in those days. You go to these folk festivals, whether they're in Mountain View, Arkansas, or somewhere else, and with the exception of the really big ones, like at Newport and a few other places, they were usually just locals who were singing and playing, and that was part of the allure of them. You get to see authentic people singing their authentic songs as people thought they were. And the earliest folk festivals in Mountain View, Arkansas, actually took place at the old high school. Nowadays, starting in the mid-'60s, and nowadays they take place for the most part on the courthouse lawn. That's the courthouse in Mountain View, Arkansas, and the main stage is there on the courthouse lawn, and they kind of rotate people in and out on the main stage. And then it was in the same town where the Ozark Folk Center opened 10 years later, and it was the impetus for the Folk Center largely came from the success of the Arkansas Folk Festival. People so interested, especially in the music. They were interested in the folk arts and crafts as well, but the music was 90% of what people came to the folk festival for, and the reason that the Ozark Folk Center was built there. And it's still operating today, or it will be once season cranks up here in April. They'll be heading into their, what will that be, the their 41st season. So you had the festival movement, which in turn spurred interest in folk music, ballads, these old string band sounds, and this interest in the music spurred interest in the folk festival. So it all kind of worked together.